University of Alaska Fairbanks Professor Emeritus Dr. David Klein, or Dave, holds degrees from the Universities of Connecticut, a Bachelor of Science in 1951, Alaska, a Master's of Science in 1953, and British Columbia, where he got his doctorate in 1963. He worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Southeast Alaska before statehood. Then after statehood, he jumped over to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. He served 35 years as leader and senior scientist with the Alaska Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at UAF. He served as a major advisor for 66 master's and PhD recipients. Most of his research has centered on the ecology of northern ungulates and their ecosystem dynamics in Alaska. He served on the Arctic Environmental Council of the Arctic Institute of North America that provided environmental oversight during the construction of the Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline. He served on the National Research Council panels to evaluate wolf and bear management in Alaska and to assess management policy for wildlife in Yellowstone National Park. He is the recipient of the Aldo Leopold Award from the Wildlife Society and the Meritorious Service Award from the U.S. Department of the Interior. He's been involved in investigations of influences of climate warming on wildlife and their habitats in the Arctic as one of the lead authors in a 2005 Arctic Climate Impact Assessment. Now our next guest is University of Alaska Fairbanks Professor Emeritus Dr. Daniel Hawkins. He received his Bachelor and Master's of Science degrees in chemistry from Montana State College in Bozeman, and his PhD, there's a ringer in every audience, I think, and his PhD in geochemistry from Pennsylvania State University. He has 2 patents held by the Department of Energy, Los Alamos. His professional research centered on geochemistry of natural waters and the application of statistical analysis of water-rock interactions. Following his doctorate studies, he worked for the U.S. Geological Survey and the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission at the National Reactor Testing Station in Idaho. He and his family arrived in Fairbanks in August 1967, just days following the flood. Besides his other research work at UAF, he, along with colleagues and grad students, did groundbreaking research into arsenic and radon in the Fairbanks area. Before retiring, he served for 6 months as the Director of Graduate Studies at UAF, and among his distinctions, he says he's most proud of 2 outstanding teaching awards he received, one from UAF Alumni Association in 1982, and the other from the College of Natural Sciences in 1988. Please welcome our guests. Now, I always begin this with a projecting voice, but if at some point during the evening you have trouble hearing us, we have some microphones here, and we'll resort, and I'll hand out the microphones, and we'll continue that way. Okay, so on to the questions. Dave, let's begin with your early years. You were drawn to the sciences early on, and were your parents scientifically oriented?
Well, yes and no. I was drawn early on in Connecticut and in Vermont. Before that, I was born in Massachusetts, and so I was a New Englander. And my mother was a terrific botanist, but she was not formally trained. But she knew plants, and so she would love to go for long walks, and I was always the one that volunteered to go with her because I learned so much, and of course I loved her, but I had learned so much from her. And my father was sort of a Renaissance man, and I regretted I didn't have the opportunity to spend more time with him, although he spent a lot of time with the family until the war, and he was working 12-hour shifts, and it was important because financially we meant to change the life because we had squeaked through the Depression as rather poor people. And everything turned around. But my father was a brilliant man. He not university trained, but he was well read and was informed on areas that weren't necessarily the favorite of my mother, like ecology and evolution. So they got along fine, though.
Well, but it sounds like you like being outdoors.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Now, speaking of outdoors, Dan, you grew up on a small farm in Montana, and it contained limestone deposits and warm springs. You say that sparked your curiosity. In what way?
First, a correction. Small ranch.
Small ranch.
Farms of the Midwest. Big difference in the Montana ranches. Now,
I stand corrected.
Even if it's not any bigger than this place, it's a ranch. No, the reason it sparked my interest is that we moved out to this place when I was a little kid, 6 years old. And so there's a spring coming, well, just look at those, the back there. It's just as if there's limestone back there. And where the projection booth is, there's a spring just bringing water down. And if I were playing with my little cars at the base of that limestone, I'd find that there were fossils in it. So there would be some things that looked like filled-in washers. These were crinoid stems, section of them. I didn't know that then. And then there were seashells. Basically, these were they were not mollusks yet, but they were obviously shells that I could recognize. And so the other thing that, you know, so obviously fossils, something living that had been living, and now it's in a rock. But the other thing is that, let's suppose that we'll move that projection booth over there to the door. The door was warm springs. The projection booth now was cold, and the door over there was warm. And so the question is now, how could that be? Now, I couldn't figure that out until about 20 years ago when I was teaching the groundwater course. But the point is that just these differences that you could see as a kid, and just the fun of floating my little boats, you know, that I'd have whittled out of kindling and floating them down the creeks and realizing, hey, there's a difference in temperature here, I wonder why. So that's what prompted it, and it's stuck with me ever since.
Well, now, were you encouraged to pursue those questions when you were younger?
Oh, yeah. In other words, basically, you couldn't keep me from it. But my folks were not scientifically trained. My dad had about 3.5 years at the University of Washington. And just as an aside, he was born at Cook City, Montana, which is a small mining town right in the center north section of Yellowstone Park. My grandfather was the U.S. Marshal there. Anyway, the point of my dad getting off to University of Washington is that although he grew up at Miles City, the Everett, Washington was hiring football players. Butte, Montana hired football players at the same time. So Dad and his partner went out to Everett, Washington, hired on to play football, and then after 1 year they went on and worked at part way through at the University of Washington. And so that's Dad there, and ultimately he came back to Montana after the First World War. My mom was born over in Laverne, Minnesota, southwestern Minnesota, right on the border between Iowa, South Dakota, and Minnesota. Family moved to southern, just a little north of Dillon, Montana. They had a sheep ranch there. Ultimately went broke on it in the late 20s. It's hard to make money ranching. But anyway, I grew up then in this ranching community. And the other thing, and you may come back to this, but one of the things that was so important about this little town of Dillon was that in southwestern Montana, we had this teacher's college. It was 1889 that Montana became a state. And they divvied up the various particular institutions that were going to be there. Eastern Montana, central Montana got nothing. Dillon got the normal college, Missoula got the University of Montana, Butte or Bozeman got what was Montana State College, the College of Agriculture. The insane asylum went to Warm Springs. Ultimately,
There was a lot of bidding on that one.
a lot of bidding on that one. But anyway, all of this was in southwestern Montana. But this was all ranching country. And so these were sheep ranching country. And I want to put this in because Dad used to comment when he went off to the First World War. He always said, "Where are you from?" somebody would say. And the answer would come up, not from Dad, "Montana." "Where are you going?" "Back." And so that was it. Montana was the sheep ranching, and my part of the world put it out there.
You were real cut-ups out there in Montana, weren't you?
Well, it's kind of like Alaska. There's not a hell of a lot else to do.
Dave, you got your undergraduate degrees back east at the University of Connecticut, but you pursued your master's here. What drew you to Alaska?
It was sort of the mystique of the opposite end of the continent of the United States. And during right out of high school, when I completed high school in 1945, I was 1A for we were still at war in the Pacific. And so I joined the Navy, and 6 months after I was in, the war was over, I was in training to become a Navy pilot. But of course, after the war was over, I didn't want it. I had become sort of a pacifist by that time, and by staying out of the war, I guess. But at any rate, I got out of the Navy, but I was not focused on what I wanted to do with my life. My buddies, close buddies, were all either going into engineering after Sputnik and or business administration, because Hartford, Connecticut was close by, where the insurance company needed accountants and people with that kind of training. And none of those interested me. I was more interested in farming, and then I was interested in dairy farming because I liked animals and freedom to be your own boss and those kind of things. And then when I came to the realization, I wanted to see the world. I hadn't seen it in the Navy. I just saw Carolinas, I guess, on the place, and Great Lakes Naval Training Station near Chicago. And so I was working in forestry then, because that was just woods work, which I learned to love very much. And I thought of being a forester, but I thought, I don't want to do woods work all my life, but even though I enjoyed it very much. So there was a bunch of us veterans that had come out of the war, and about my age, or a bit older, and we enjoyed the woodwork, but there was a lot of camaraderie, friendship between us, and we'd sit around a fire with some dead wood that we could muster for lunchtime, and make coffee and eat our lunch, and talk about what we're going to do. And I said, I want to see more of the country, and two others felt the same way. And I said, well, to me, the Great North Woods in Maine or Lake of the Woods, that was great. And then one of them said, they just built a highway to Alaska. So
you were hooked.
I was hooked, and so we had to have a car that would be functional to get there. And I had an old junker Model A Ford Roadster that had a typical Alaskan type of 2x4s and little plywood for the top, and it would never have made it to Alaska. And so I kept my eyes open, and I saw one advertise a Model A Roadster, in good condition, except the motor was all taken apart, and they had renewed the parts, but they apparently the person that had it wanted to was a young person, and he had a job offer down in the lower 48 that he couldn't resist, and he just walked away from it. So it was for sale, but the engine was apart. And I'd never been really focused. My brother was 2 years older. He was focused on taking cars apart and putting them back together again, but not me. But once you have to have one, and I learned with some good advice from my brother, and I put that thing back together again, and it's all with all these new parts, and it was just ideal. And
it worked.
It worked.
Oh.
And then drove to Alaska. Well, you know how it is when you're going from Connecticut. At that time, you had to stop and get permission to go over the highway from the RCMP in Edmonton, and you had to have $200 in cash between you and that. So there are two of us that finally ended up going, and my Roadster, and I had to have all the spare parts that you normally have at that time of the growth of the automobile industry, and I had all those, and you had to have 15 gallons of water. You were expected to camp out because there was nothing, no places yet built for camping, no campgrounds, but there was plenty of places to pull off the road and nice personal campgrounds, and then you had to have firefighting tools, because the word
Holy
was
smokes.
if a fire came out, you were required to, by Yukon and BC, to stop and help fight the fires, which was a reasonable thing.
Yeah.
At any rate, we passed all these things. I had to have shovel and a pickaxe, I think, too. That was partly firefighting, but we used shovel and pickaxe to repair the road in places that had been a wet spring. And,
you know, I'm surprised you're not Canadian, you know? I mean, at some point.
I thought about that.
Just giving up.
Yeah, just break down in the middle. Okay, that's where we are.
Well, we made it in about 3 weeks, and we had one flat only, and made a mistake, and we went to Lake of the Woods, which wasn't a mistake, but then we're in the prairies, and there's no paved roads then, and the roads all went right angle this way. So you go about 1.5 times as if I'd stayed in Montana, I would have probably found a little more direct route. And then it was cold. The wind was blowing. The farmers were out there plowing their field, but they were parkers on. They didn't have these closed-in tractors in, and we had no windows on the side, no side curtains. So we had to wear a stocking cap when we were driving, but it was nirvana for me.
Yeah, boy, that sounds like nirvana to me. But you came directly to Fairbanks.
Came to Fairbanks, and then we didn't have any money left. And Ed Wash, the guy that came with me, he had been in the military a little bit longer, and he'd learned to switch trains in a train station or central in Europe. And so he got a job right away switching trains at Fort Wainwright, it was called Ladfield then. But my plan was I wanted to get in the field, and I'd heard that Geology was the only place where there were field parties, and it was a wet spring, so there was no fires, so no firefighting. I was prepared to do that. Anything to make money, almost.
Almost except geology.
Yeah.
But no, geology. But I was about 10 days too late. They'd already filled the positions and went up into NPRA. And I talked to some of them when they came back, and they were so damn lucky. If I'd known, I'd try to make that. But at any rate, so then I was staying in the cheapest boarding house where you paid 25 cents for a bunk in the basement, and I met two other guys. One was a young guy like myself from Oklahoma, and we both were looking for work and needed a job badly. And the other guy was what we considered an older guy. He was about 35, and he knew how to. He was a good carpenter, and he was subcontracting to putting siding on new houses that were being built, the first ones in Fairbanks after the war. Oh. And so he said, join up with me. Well, it was more complicated than that. He said
Of course it was.
He had overwintered in the Brooks Range at Wild Lake. And that caught my and Chris's eyes. He said, if we work all summer long and save enough money to charter aircraft, he wanted to go up there and start a hunting and fishing lodge. We'd build a log cabin and hunt and fish and have a great time, which we did. Although it didn't, we had to go on strike. And
well, let's come back to the strike. But I wanted to turn back to Dan. You said you had a mentor in Dr. Charles Bradley. And what was remarkable about him? Why was he a mentor?
Well, basically it's because he presented an entirely different view of life and the environment than I grew up with. You see, my grandfather was an ex-Texas Ranger. If you look back to Lonesome Dove, my grandfather and his brother could be those two Texas men that rode up there. Anyway, my grandfather was in the Company D, the Frontier Battalion of the Texas Rangers. He left that after 6 years, started up to Montana in about 1875 to 1876. They rode all the way up, stopping off through the Black Hills, ultimately got to Fort Keogh. And amongst other things, given that he'd had all this particular training as a lawman, and I've raised these things not to think, but I was so steeped in the real Old West. My grandfather was it, his brother was that. One of the things that also raised the issue and brought it back to Charlie Bradley was the fact that my grandfather and his brother killed 4,000 buffalo and shipped them out of what became Miles City. And so this buffalo went back east to become hides, or to become essentially leather belts to run the industry, even though Goodyear had devised the vulcanizing of rubber about in 1839. It hadn't caught on yet. So there was a period of time when industry was powered by leather belts worldwide. And the buffaloes of Montana, they didn't become bison in Montana until about 1950. They were buffalo until then. Anyway, until at that time. So that was the big thrust. So anyway, growing up in a family with that thing, and as I say, as my grandfather, there's about one slip generation in between there. My grandfather was in his 40s when Dad was born. Dad was in his 40s when I was born, and so we had this slip. So there's that jump. So anyway, growing up in the big ranching country at the time in southwestern Montana, a ranch would be, there might be the one that my dad managed, was about 55,000 acres, of which typically there would be about 10 to 12,000 acres was deeded land that you actually owned and bought, and it was along a creek where you could raise hay. The rest of it was Taylor grazing land. And so if you'd started into this country in the 1880s, you'd gone through this Taylor Vasing land about, as we find now, at about 4 generations or so. That land that you're paying, you know, just a lease on through 4 generations, you begin to think that's yours. Well, in about the 1950s, they changed the Taylor grazing over and the BLM came in. And instead of being this benign thing of landlord that we'd had for generations in Montana, now you're actually a landlord there. And so now when you think back and you hear all these people are pushing back against the federal government, it's not that, it's just they'd been leasing this land from the feds for, let's say, 100 years, but it's only now that it does belong to the feds. So anyway, what I'm saying now, to back to your question, I was raised in that environment. As far as I was concerned, by gosh, well, it was too bad about the buffalo, but that's just how it worked. And if there were barbed wire fences, we had to do that to keep the buffalo out or keep your cows in. So when I met Charlie Bradley, who had grown up actually in Wisconsin, and ultimately, to get ahead of the story, he was ultimately became a director of the Aldo Leopold Center in Baraboo, Wisconsin, after he retired from there. So just picture somebody coming out of this wild background that I have of ranching, and Aldo Leopold. You know, there's got to be something that's going to go like that. And I think the thing that was so important to me is that Charlie Bradley was the only man that all of a sudden, he would just said quietly, he said, you know, Dan, he said, it's too bad that some of those buffalo couldn't still be here, that we didn't have all that barbed wire fence, that we ought to have that grass that's still there, that your grandpa saw when he was killing the buffalo. So when he put it that way, it was a revelation that there truly was an other side to that view than what I was raised on. And so ultimately, I have become, and now proudly, an environmentalist. I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about the water. I'm concerned about those things. And yet I realize, still looking back at my home fronts and the people that are there now, we're still fighting the battle. It's now, as I say, the bison come out of Yellowstone Park, but they're carrying brucellosis. They still bash through the barbed wire fence, but this time they infect your cattle. And so we still have that give and take and a balance. Sure. But this particular son of Montana looks on those bison somewhat favorably now. So that's what it was. But it was just this remarkable man, a member of the 10th Mountain Division, an artist, a photographer, a man that ultimately wrote a book about an Aleutian summer when he was in the 10th Mountain Division on ADAC. And he was just such a marvelous teacher. So anyway, convincing.
Well, I'm going to keep you there because I'm going to get you to Alaska.
Okay.
And we'll avoid the labor conflicts here on this one. But you were on a field season with Bob Chapman.
That's correct.
Tell me about that.
Okay, well, anyway, I'd finished my master's at Bozeman. I was a geochemist at that time. I went to work for the geochemical exploration section of the USGS. As I told you, sort of like sort of chemical gold panning. And they sent me to Yakobi Island, which is in southeastern Alaska, right near Chichagof, and some of you know we're not too far from Pelican. Never been there before, and Bob Chapman was the field leader. But the thing that was interesting is, in my job with the USGS in Denver, where I was stationed, would be to take chemical methods that would be in the literature and modify them for use in the field. So basically, I brought up some techniques to take them out to Yakobi. We tried them out there, cooking them in a log cabin, et cetera, et cetera. And The thing, however, that really set the hook for me to bring me back was not only Bob Chapman being there, but it was the first experience I'd had of flying in with a small plane, but I drew the magic thing to fly out on a helicopter. So they came in with a float-equipped helicopter, which ultimately I flew many times later, but there was a mechanic and the pilot and me, and I sat in the middle seat there, and turns out this copter pilot was, he was crazy. He was a Wyoming cowboy, so just fit it, there's a Wyoming cowboy, a Montana ranch kid there in the middle, and a fella from Texas on the right who was a mechanic. And so the pilot says, you know, fellas, he says, when I flew in, he says, I flew over Admiralty, and he said, by God, he says, there was a big grizzly there, and he was eating on another one. Let's go look for him. So we flew over there, and there was this grizzly feeding on this other one, so we dove down on that grizzly, and he'd come up like that, and you know, we're around. I was hoping we didn't fail. And then he says, on our way back, he says, we'll swing around here, we'll come back kind of the long way toward Juneau. He says, got the thing, but he said, I saw some killer whales coming over. So he says, let's see if we can get a shot at one. And I thought, God, this is neat. This is Montana big time. So we went out, and there were the killer whales. They're coming like this. The mechanic was on the side there, and I held his belt while he crawled out on the float, grabbed the rifle, got back in, and we took off and came back, and the whales are coming this, and the guy says again, he says, oh, he says, he says the fishermen just hate these things. He says they get into their nets. He says they do that. He says we're doing those fishermen a favor. So we're coming like this, and here's this fella. He's on the right-hand side. He's got their thing, so as we're coming over, he shoots. Well, you know, you've got a couple angles there, and he overshot him. And this pilot, this says, by God, he says, you're from Texas, and you can't shoot, you can't hit a whale? and I agreed with him. You know, I'm sitting there, this was besides which this man from Wyoming, I knew his uncle, who was a dentist in Twin Bridges, Montana, just down the road from us. So, you know, we were pretty close. Well, anyway, when you get back to this point, you know, of that sort of thing, and leaping ahead now to where I go back to finally coming to Alaska, following a PhD, et cetera, I wanted to come to Alaska, you know, with that sort of a background.
Yeah,
Of course. Anyway, it turns out Bob Chapman had been doing a lot of the work. He was a field geologist here, well known, and his office was right across the hall from Bob Forbes, whom well-known geologist here in the University of Alaska. So I wrote Bob Chapman, is there a job there? He says, well, I'll walk across the hall and find out. So we went over, and Bob Forbes said, yes, we're looking for a geochemist. And so I wrote a letter of application to Bob Forbes, and he says, well, we've got this great project of heavy metals project, it's called. We're just kind of going to prospect and analyze the soils and rocks in the general Fairbanks district for partly for gold, but also trace metals associated. And he says, will you be the analytical chemist, the geochemist on this? And I said, you bet. So that's what brought me there, and how I got there. And Chapman was the one who was the leader there, and he knew me, and he realized all about why the hook was set, and so there I am. So I've been there ever since.
You know, I think the takeaway from tonight is don't drive with Dave Klein and don't fly with Dan Hawkins. I think I'm getting the kind of focus here on this thing.
Yeah, it's something.
Dave, now you worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Southeast Alaska before statehood, and then Fish and Game for the stay after statehood. Can you, at some point we should go back to the labor conflict that you had out in that cabin, or building, but talk about the difference between those two experiences.
I should correct that was my fault on bio, and I used the Fish and Wildlife Service. At that time, it was called the Biological Survey. So, yeah, it was the Biological Survey that became the Fish and Wildlife Service. But now, what specifically you wanted to know?
So what was the difference? What was the focus? What were the experiences like
between the state and federal and territorial?
That shift to statehood.
Well, territorial was the federal government was in charge and responsible for all fish and wildlife management in the territory of Alaska, and there was what was called a game commission then that dealt with the wildlife, and these were 5 senior men who were hunters or guides or fishermen, and I got to meet all of them, and they were really terrific guys because when they had the responsibility, they stood up to the challenge, and they wanted to be sure there wasn't too much illegal harvests of fish and wildlife, but mainly wildlife because that was their area of responsibility. But they also realized that it was all important to the economy because then there were in Southeast Alaska, a lot of the fishermen, when they weren't in the fishing season, they might be guide outfitters and they'd make thousands of dollars for rich people from Texas mainly.
They must have heard about the killer whales.
That's right.
But they wanted trophies. And bears. And so the bears would have been in trouble because the fishermen didn't like them. And sometimes they were accused of just especially the salmon trollers, that were usually hand trollers, as they were called, and they going by the beach and there was a bear out on the beach, they would shoot the bear, which was illegal, and they could go to jail for that and pay a big fine because the locals wanted these people that made money and they were good citizens with the guide outfitting. So the bears were important. Whereas they were the same type as the killer whale hunters when it came to, there was a bounty on literally everything that ate fish eggs or fish, salmon, except for the fish that ate fish. Like the rainbow trout were considered, and dolly vardens were considered predators on salmon and salmon eggs. So yeah, they were, when I first came, there was a territorial legislature passed bills on bounties, and you paid 25 cents for the tail of every rainbow trout you caught. Well, because of the value of the salmon. And then one time there was $3 for the scalp of a hair seal because they ate, especially at the mouth of the Copper River, while the fishermen were fishing there, and they ate the salmon out of the nets, and they were bad. And then, the locals there were making money taking the scalp of hair seals, and then natives on the North Slope were living off of seal, and they thought, why can't they get $3 for the scalp? Because they're not, they want the seals to go on living, but they've been killing seals for their traditional hundreds of years and thousands. And so politically, let's be fair and give the bounty to them. And the same happened with bounty on wolves, and people in Anactuva Pass liked the wolves because they liked the skin for parkers, and but they didn't want to kill too many. And then the bounty was so kept raising it with this bounty mania, sort of, that if we kill more wolves, we'll have more moose and caribou and mountain sheep. And the people at Anactuva Pass were concerned, and because for a while, they were tempted to literally harvest wolf pups for the bounty, but don't take too many because we want them to be able to do this on an annual basis. So the bounty system was really screwed up in terms of wildlife management. One of the first things that we did when statehood came is we lobbied the new state legislature to get rid of fish traps. That was easy. And then to get rid of bounties. And we gradually got rid of most of them. And then, but then we had the problem with under the federal system, we had a predator and rodent control, and they stayed on because some people like to have, especially reindeer herders didn't like to have coyotes and wolves around their herds, and they want them killed, and they even want red foxes killed on the eastern Aleutians, because the red foxes could kill newborn lambs where they had sheep ranches there, and so they wanted all the red foxes killed, and they were mostly living off of voles and birds and some fish. So yeah, it was a different era, and fortunately, in the transition from territorial times, then I was working for the federal government, but in the Fish and Wildlife Service or Biological Survey, and those jobs were eliminated, and then it was up to us to either move to the state, quit the federal government and move to the state, which I did because I didn't want to leave, or they would guarantee me a job down in the lower 48, which I suddenly had lost all interest to me.
Well, now you specialize in ungulates in the ecosystem. Why that concentration? Why that interest?
It started out with when I was working for Fish and Game in Southeast Alaska, and I had a job that after I finished a master's degree here, I got this permanent job, the first one in Southeast, based in Petersburg, and I was responsible for ecological studies with deer in Southeast and management of the deer, regional management responsibility. Deer were really important to the local people, but there were lots of them, and controversy over what caused their populations to change, but it was pretty much, our research showed that it was severe winters really knocked them down. And then, yeah, wolves might hold them down longer, but the wolves were not serious predators when you didn't have severe winters. But Southeast was nirvana for me because I was becoming a scientist and comparing situations. And there you had islands with wolves and deer and black bears, and then other islands with no wolves and brown bears only, no black bears, Admiralty, Baranof, and Chichikov, and deer on virtually all islands. And so I started research for Fish and Game, and one of the problems with the transition was the federal government owned most of the land in Alaska, and even when statehood came, they still own much of it. And so the new Department of Fish and Game, the federal government that included the Forest Service, and they were responsible for the habitat. It didn't make sense that habitat didn't change to the Fish and Game. And state Fish and Game focused on animal population dynamics because they wanted the numbers for harvest, setting harvest levels, et cetera. And so that was a real mistake that continued to this day, that nobody in the Board of Game is trained to think about habitat. So we have this problem where the only way you can increase the moose populations, the Board of Game thinks, and sport hunters frequently think, is kill more predators. They kill moose calves. whereas the moose have been too high population for so long that there's no good winter forage left. No willows. It's on the Kenai is a good example, and it's just habitat has changed so much because they let the moose and snowshoe hares control habitat, and they wouldn't leave much for the moose to continue to be sustained. So but the positive thing was during this transition period, these biologists like myself, who were working for the federal government and a lot of the others, they were committed on good management for Alaska. And then I transferred to Fish and Game, and then that new Fish and Game department was mostly graduates of the program here, some of whom, like Jim Brooks, who had been a classmate of mine, and they were into modern game management, not the old school predator-prey relationship and population numbers only. So I thought it was, my focus on the deer in Southeast was habitat. And I did that then when we became a state, I realized, I'm a scientist and I need to get a PhD. And I've been cooperating with British Columbia and the University of British Columbia, where they're doing excellent work on deer habitat with all of the coastal black-tailed deer, including the Sitka black-tail. And so we sometimes would have fawn pickups and what to do with them. They'd give them to us, and we didn't know what to do with them. And because they had become imprinted on humans, and then you just release them. That wasn't realistic. So then Professor Cowan there at UBC, as head of the biology department, he was a famous biologist, and so I worked with shipping these deer calves or fawns to him, and that was tricky because we had to get them in a hurry when they were still being bottle fed. Put them in a cardboard box and with a lot of shavings to absorb moisture, and you gave them milk before you put them in the box, and then you put them on the Grumman goose that flew into Petersburg and landed in the harbor, and they took it to Annette Island, to Ketchikan, and then Annette Island, and then that's where a plane, Constellation, that flew to Anchorage but stopped at Annette to refuel. They would be transferred there and then to Seattle, and then Professor Cowan or with graduate students would go down, drive down to Seattle and get these boxes, and it was down to 3 or 4 hours since they had been put in, and then they took them back and put them in their paddocks and
quite an operation.
But we never had any losses of fawns when we did this. It was amazing, and because they mostly, when it was dark and the containers, we had holes in them, but they'd been fed, and then they would normally be sleeping just like a little baby rabbit's fed, and it worked fine. And then I realized the best place for me to continue my education was UBC, University of British Columbia, which I did, and took leave of absence from a job that I had with Fish and Game, a new job. But at least I had guarantee I could come back. In the summers I came back and did research, and I was paid full salary then. But in the meantime, I had married a school teacher in Petersburg and started a family. So fortunately, they were from Washington State, and so they would, in the summers, they would go down and stay with their grandparents and family, and then in the winters when I had to be at UBC, we all joined in, and so the whole family there at Vancouver, and yeah, it worked. It was.
Well, it seemed to. I mean, you got your doctorate and everything.
Yeah, yeah.
But I want to shift over to Dan for a minute, because before we get you to Alaska, you hold 2 patents, Dan, and neither one is in geochemistry. So what gives?
Well, several things. The patents in that, actually it is from geochemistry, but when we left off between hunting the whale and Bob Chapman going across the hall to get a job, I got a PhD at Penn State, and I worked almost 7 years for the Atomic Energy Commission as a geochemist doing research on radioactive waste disposal in Idaho Falls in the National Reactor Testing Station. And so what I did then is, and I think you mentioned it in the material you sent me, I left the Atomic Energy Commission in 1967 to come up here. And the reason I did is that I'd done pretty well there in terms of it, and if I was going to continue with the AEC, they offered me a GS-14. I'm only 33 years old, and they said, if you were going to get that, you know, you're doing well here, but the only position we got is there, and you got to go back to Washington, D.C.
What is a GS-14? I don't know.
That was pretty high up in the procedure there. You start out at about a GS-9. Okay. So I was making up a lot of the officer in charge of our division in Idaho was a GS-50. So yeah, I was making progress pretty fast. Anyway, the point I was trying to get to is that it would have made a major change in my lifestyle. I'd had a little practice to teach down at Idaho State as part of my effort at Idaho in the reactor testing station, so I knew I wanted to teach, et cetera, et cetera. But to get ahead finally to the point, coming back to Bob Chapman and all, one of the things when I left the AEC, and I came up here, you know, I was left but not forgotten by them, because 2 years after I came here, as a geochemist instructor, etc., I got a call from the AEC, and they said, we want you to be our U.S. representative to the International Atomic Energy Agency Symposium on the use of local minerals in radioactive waste disposal. So I've been away from the AEC, working up here, just kind of plucked out and sent over there. And this was a magical thing because I'd never been to Europe. And I plunked down in Vienna in mid-spring, and all of this thing, an international thing, but it was also a sobering thing, and it was also provided a lot of realization, because this commission that I was working with there at the time, it was a room like this, and we had a big table, and back there at the back were a batch of translators. And so I was sitting here at a table, and just like Dave, there was a man, Professor Berak from Czechoslovakia, and we had little microphones there, and we had headphones, and there were the translators. But before they started doing any of these things, and it says something about American education, it said, now the lectures were going to be given either in English, Spanish, Italian, French, German, Russian, or Slovak, whatever they wanted, but everything. But it said, for the benefit of the American, all papers will be presented in English. But they said the questions will be asked in your native tongue or the tongue of the speaker. And so immediately I saw, well, I'm certainly not up to snuff in that business. But while I'm sitting there listening to these questions being asked, and I've got my earphones on, Professor Berak, who's sitting there with headphones around, and I said, my God, Professor Berak, I said, you understand, it was 5 languages. And he'd ask the questions in there. And he said, Hawkins, he said, don't be impressed. He said, don't be envious. He said, It's the curse of a small country. And that was it. But anyway, what I was trying to say, because you asked this question about zeolites and on about this patent. I'd worked at the AEC, and one of the things that I studied was tritium, which is the radioactive isotope of hydrogen. So it's got a 10.3-year half-life. Now, the reason it comes back up here is that at the time, the Department of the Department of Transportation, which handles the Bush airports, had a tritium-based lighting system put out on the things there. They had them, and at that time, I believe they were using liquid tritium. And so the question is, that's not good. They had something close in the old units, the ones that I remember, about 100 curies of tritium per lighting unit there. That's a lot of radioactivity on the loose there if it's either gaseous or in liquid form. So what happened as part of this thing is we had a former staff member up here at University of Alaska, Lee Leonard, who'd left here, gone to work for DOE. And he, at DOE, they decided, and he'd been working on these radio lights. And he said he'd arranged and convinced them, DOE, that we ought to convene a meeting where people come together for about 3 days and brainstorm and figure out, you know, something that not only that in that particular thing, but to come away with a patent or 2 patents. And so this was a remarkable thing because it's the only time I'd ever said there was, and in this case, even though I was coming from here, I guess they still considered me somehow, once in the AEC, it becomes DOE, you're still part of them. So I went back there, and it was a most interesting thing because DOE had said, you know, we're paying all this money to bring about 20 of you folks down here, and we do this. You're not the only ones we bring down here. It was Florida in April, but we don't get any money back. We get nothing but words, basically, is that. So he said, we want some action. We want some patents. So I didn't know. So we sat there and just brainstormed, and it happened to be that my contribution to this particular thing were 2 things. I didn't tell you, but my first love were zeolites. So that takes us off on a particular thing. Molecular sieves, but they were neat. So I knew 2 things, that there was a molecular sieve, a synthetic one, that you could just load to the gills with tritiated water. And the question that we didn't have was, can I also stuff a fluorescent dye or something in there so that when it's irradiated? So basically what I suggested was a glorified radioactive watch dial, but it's in something on the side of this. But the neat thing was, you know, that I had some knowledge because I did work on tritiated water in waste disposal in Idaho, and I knew the zeolites intimately, and this happened to be one. The other group I shared a patent with, I didn't do any work on it, but we just shared each other's ideas, was essentially the same thing but with an organic device. But the point that I'm on this, and this is a point I'd like to leave for the people in the Institute and for the folks here at the university. The first question that arose on that thing was not what are we going to do, but what outfit is going to patent the device that you come up with? And to a person, I didn't know, everybody else were from national labs. And to a person, they said, Los Alamos. Los Alamos. It was just like that. There was no, and I had no idea. You know, I couldn't contribute anything to it, but I said, yeah, Los Alamos, as if I knew anything. And the point that I got in talking to people I'd flown down later subsequently to check on how things, I didn't do anything on that other than suggesting it, figuring it out how it might go, and then some of the folks in the national labs working in their radioactive labs did this thing, but I go down and check on it. But I had no idea, but everyone said, boy, if you want to patent something, go to Los Alamos. So I bring it back to this point. There's ideas that come out of the Geophysical Institute, that come out of our research labs here, that well, you look at something. I got a patent for just glorifying, by God, radioactive watch dial. The stuff that's been out here, we ought to be just dripping in patents. It just absolutely, and so my suggestion, I don't know our patent officers. I think they're probably very good, very decent people. But my impression is that the people that know patents have put as much effort into getting a knowledgeable patent officer, somebody who knows how to do the job, who knows the ropes, who knows what's done, knows how to push it. Put that much effort into getting that person as you're putting into getting a research geochemist, for example. And then, by God, I think we'd see some patents out of here. So that's just my aside there. Now I've kind of lost track, but
no.
So that's where I went with this patent.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you went there. But looking at the clock, we're already at an hour. So I want to ask a couple of big round robin questions as we kind of wrap things up. What were your first impressions of the university when you got here? What are there any standout experiences or personalities that you encountered? And then also, I think you touched on it in a way, Dan. I also want, the other big question is, it seems like the university, the academy these days is geared in a certain way so that curiosity may not be honored as much as it used to be. That may be a mistake, but I'd love to get both of yours takes on that. So first we'll ask Dave, any kind of first impressions that at the school here?
It's like everything else, it's a little complicated in that, in that when I first came up here, I spent the winter here, and I needed a job. So I came to I figured, where the hell am I going to get a job in the wintertime? During summers when construction was going on and forest fires need to be controlled. So because I had this interest in farming when I was a boy, I thought, well, let's go out to that experimental farm out there. So I had my Model A, and so I drove out there, and I introduced myself and to the superintendent, and I said, do you have any jobs for me? I have to, I want to go back to Connecticut and to go to the university, but I need a job and for the winter. And they said, well, do you mind shoveling manure? And he was testing me. And I said, no, that's part of farming, and this is an experimental farm. And he said, well, you can be the dairyman's helper, which was, yeah, I shoveled manure, but I also had to help feed the cows and set up the milking and got to help with the milking machines and handling the milk. And the guy, the herdsman, was just a fine man, and he liked training a young guy. And so we got along fine. But then I learned some things that I always wanted to learn if I was going to be a farmer. They had a team of horses, and I learned how to harness them and use them. We hauled single horse, easy to handle, and a small sled, and we cleared the flats that are now agricultural field. Gradually, there was mostly white spruce and good fuel for the barn because they had the big hot air furnace, and we cut our own wood. Well, so we had to bring the wood in and wait. They had to wait a while before you cut it, so it would dry a bit. And then we cut it with the old-fashioned engine, one-cylinder engine that just started and had a water jacket, and it would go and a big flywheel, and then it's geared up to the saw, and then you had the table, and it takes about 3 people to take a log and cut them off. And for the furnace, we could cut them this big. But we cut all of that stuff, dragged them in, and I remember I didn't get into the history of University's Last book that Bill Casson wrote, but he had a photograph at that same time of another young guy driving another horse, and he was giving Bunnell, the president, a ride. He was interested. So I got to know Bunnell, and it was just wonderful. He was such a nice guy, but he liked the fact that, yeah, we have to do a lot of things ourselves. That in a university or college in the lower 48, it's totally different than here.
It seemed like it would be a closed, tight community, or
it was small, very small then. I think it was only a little over 300 students, and so it's pretty small. I knew that, you know, and it was a mining and
careful now there, Dave. You're getting on my territory.
It was both mining and, yeah, I took a coal planning course in the evenings, and then I also I realized I was going back to the University of Connecticut, where I was a resident, and they had an excellent program in wildlife. They didn't have anything like that here, and so I thought I wasn't a good student in high school, especially in things that I didn't particularly like math and English, and so I thought that my grades are so poor, I won't get admitted unless I go prepare to take an exam back at the University of Connecticut. So I better bone up, and so I took some bonehead courses in algebra, for example. Here, yeah, in that winter, 1948 spring semester, and I was staying at the experimental farm. So in those days, you know, walking here was not a big deal, and my car was up in blocks because I couldn't run it in the winter. I couldn't afford to buy alcohol to put it in the radiator, keep it from freezing, and then you had too much alcohol. It was almost straight alcohol, and then it just evaporated right away.
Yeah.
Anyway, I didn't use the car much. I maybe started it once or twice in the wintertime, and took the battery and the little cabin they let me stay in, and that was work. But then I got some exposure to the university, and yeah, there weren't many students in classes, and so you got more attention from teachers, and then I began to realize that people are different here in Alaska. I knew that, but I was learning to appreciate that difference. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons I came and stayed in Alaska. And so, yeah, then I came back again after I finished my undergraduate degree, and then there was a graduate program in wildlife through the Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit, which then I did my master's in that program, which was, it had just been established in 1950, and I came in 51, and I applied. By this time, I was motivated, and suddenly I'm an A student, and it was motivation that I needed, and I had it. And so,
to get back here.
So, but then I was impressed at the student at the university then, and I related to a lot of the students and made strong friends, and faculty as well. And it was, I don't have any regrets, and it was the quality of the program was great, and people that were, Jim Reardon was one of the teachers, and Brian Kessel was one of the young teachers, and it was a learning environment, and the friends I had, some were in anthropology and working with Ivor Scarlin, and it was
Sounds like a great experience.
I was learning, absorbing a lot of information about areas like anthropology. I was interested in it, but now I was getting more interested, and it was my advisor, because I was doing the master's degree, he wanted us to take a course in Alaska Natives and Ivor Scarlin, and I went in that first class and I thought, this isn't going to work. I couldn't understand him. His accent Norwegian accent was so strong. But after a couple of times, you got onto it, you know. And he was a wonderful guy. Yeah. And I began to realize that Alaska Natives are different. There's a lot of different cultures here. It's not just one culture, and I wanted to know more and more about it. And then later on, when I was doing field work and became head of the wildlife unit after I got my PhD, and then I did a lot of work in rural situations where we hired young Native people to come with us, and we both loved the environment, and they had the skills that I could learn from. That was very valuable to me.
I want to give Dan, because you arrived just days after the flood, didn't you?
Yeah.
You know, what was your experience?
It was very. First, I want to just say one thing. Dave's stomping all over really important stuff to me. Stomped on the mine.
Sorry.
My grandmother was from Norway, Dave. I don't know. There's just no way out of this.
I did a sabbatical leave.
Is that right?
In
Good,
Norway.
good. Well, good. Anyway, I just wanted to let you know you're in deep trouble. All right, now back to your question. Yes. I came here in '67, just about 8 or 9 days after the flood. The flood started when I left my job in Idaho, and this was where my job was. So we headed up the road, and I got here. We pulled a little camping trailer behind us, and there was still water all over the campus, and down here the dam down by the power plant was there. There was a canoe tied up to the edge of it, and the mud and stuff, and it was pretty exciting. I followed, and I ended up where we ended up, hauling my trailer up, and I parked in Red Fox Drive right across from Bob Forbes's house for about 3 weeks there. Forbes's let us in, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing I think, and my sense is that the flood was more or less a unifying thing for people who were here. When I came here, it was, well, as I look right now, there were people in this room who were my colleagues, my young friends 50 years ago. I can see more than a handful. There was a closeness that was generated by us all. You were here, all of us. There was, all of a sudden we're young. We got kids. And there seemed to be, well, if somebody's got over there and their house is up there on campus, they'll take care of the kids today. They'll do this. There was a tremendous friendliness, a camaraderie that exists to this day. I don't know what it's like coming in as a new faculty member now. That was a small university, maybe 1,500 students, if that. But it was close-knit. Everybody was, dealing with a particular issue that was common to all. But at the same time, there was a joy. At the same time, the first thing when the water went down, they had an Equinox Marathon up here. That spring, we had the first, I think it was the first, raft race. And there's still, we're still celebrating that raft race. It went on, fewer and fewer people, but we still celebrate those of us who can crawl out and remember it. But it was just this camaraderie, this sense of us, and this is our university. And I don't know that exists yet, but there was that. The other thing that probably helps is that the presidents that came in at the time, I think it was William R. Wood was the president when we came. After that, it was, well, Carl coined the phrase, talking to the presidents was like talking to a parade. You'd come over to see them, they were going down. I cannot tell you how many presidents we've had since William R. Wood was here, but there were a hell of a lot of them. They didn't last here very long. And I don't know that some of them may have been pretty good, but I didn't know them long enough.
They were
just like that. And we, frankly, I don't know that we really paid attention to the president. It was, all of us kind of did our own things within the department, within the institutes, what we were doing there. It was, I had the sense, wrongly I guess, that we more or less ran the university. They didn't, they were getting the salary, but we were doing basically what we wanted to do, what we needed to do, etc., writing the grants, getting the money. I was getting whatever I could, and etc. So it was a very tight, close-knit, friendly place. And it still exists.
Yep.
Okay, last question. And so both of you take great pride in your relationship with your students, your grad students, and the role you played. I ask you to reflect on that then. What's the value? Are your students your legacy in some sense, would you say?
That's definitely that, and I see some of my students get their degree in a master's degree, say in wildlife, and then they don't get a job in wildlife, but they get a job in something else, and they turn out to be terrific local citizens, and they're involved, and they understand that they're not just the subject matter they're majored in is the important thing, and that's what I took pride in, the fact that students should be rounded in their knowledge as well as in specifics of wildlife ecology, and you can extend that in a lot of directions, but definitely that was the case. And then I was lucky as a professor, head of the wildlife unit, because I only had to teach one course a year, and my favorite course was a field course where it was always with the students, and it turned out to be one of the most popular courses in the Department of Biology and Wildlife. And I get to know the students. Being with the students in the field, it's totally different when you come back together in the corridors in the classroom, that they say, "Hi, Dave," and they don't mind. They sit up in front because they don't mind if I ask the question, because they know I'm going to be sensitive in asking the question, but they realize they want to learn, rather than sitting back and not losing contact with you when you're talking. That's the worst case scenario, and that the students are sometimes shy and they don't want to be up close, but they don't realize that.
But building that rapport is important.
It is, and being in the field with them or working closely in the lab with them, all of those are critically important. The time giving a lecture is, yeah, you have to do some of that, but no, that isn't all that important.
It's out in the field.
At least in the biological sciences, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Dan,
yeah.
I know you take great pride in those outstanding teaching awards.
Yeah, I did, and it was kind of surprising. Basically, you know, I didn't expect it, but basically, I think the thing I wanted to say is that I love to teach. It's I don't know. My mentor Bradley was a wonderful teacher, but the idea I love to learn. For example, the motto of Phi Kappa Phi is, "May the love of learning light your life." And that, by God, is what I tried to extend to my students. It's fun to learn, and you can get into this stuff. It's horrifying, some of the stuff we'd get into. You know, some of the thermodynamics, I didn't understand it. We'd fight it out on our own or together. But it was this sense, and also the sense of, I guess the medical people say, first do no harm. And that, you know, that's basically, do no harm, at least teach them something useful. So that was, and of course, that was anything chemical, anything geochemical was by definition something useful. So I'm obviously pulling your leg, but I really enjoyed teaching. I enjoyed the students, and we had a good rapport. And I learned a lot from them. I don't see them as a legacy. I've never thought of a legacy. I thought of, there's somebody that's come to learn something. I think I know it. I'll do my best to teach it. And I don't have, you know, any long sort of a thing of, here's a string of geochemists, you know, from Adam down there, whatever. Yeah, it's just the sense that I enjoyed the business of teaching. I enjoyed my students. And one of the things that doesn't show up, just coming back to the graduate students, is that in teaching graduate students, if you've got, as Dave has, a lot of graduate students that he taught, but on each one of those, there's a graduate committee. There's a batch of other faculty that were there. And what, by virtue of geochemistry, and I wish Paul were here because he'd agree with me, we both think that chemistry is the central science. You've got it in wherever you want to go, there's chemistry. And so because of that, I used to serve totally every year for almost 20 years on 25 different graduate committees, whether they were in IMS, in wildlife. Even I used to be a singer of sorts, and so a couple, 3 times in music, a batch over in math, but some in IMS, but there were a lot of them, so that was, I had a real good feeling for what was going on, whether somebody was doing in water resources, and okay, I've got a part of a PhD student over here in the Geophysical Institute, got that one over in IMS, so that I was spread across there, but it gave me such a breadth of it, and I learned so much. And so that's where while I don't have as many, I have maybe 10 graduate students that I taught specifically to do these, and these were people looking primarily at radon, and arsenic in particular in the water here. A couple, 3 on zeolites, my specialty. But the rest of it, I was scattered out amongst my friends here. And that's basically the graduate effort that I did, mainly because people like Dave had the grants, and I kind of would come along and try to help them. But to come back to it, yes, I don't think of my students as a legacy, but I really enjoyed them, and I hope, you know, I gave them my best. And if they had learned chemistry, any chemistry, they were better off for it than not.
Well, did you have Dana Thomas?
Dana Thomas, I hired him.
Okay.
But I took classes from Dana's. Actually, one of the things is these people in wildlife and so forth were better statisticians than the chemists, the physicists, and so forth. They knew about it. So Fred Dean, who was a good statistician, and we took a lot of classes together. And so I took classes, Fred and I would take classes from Dana and from Sam Harbaugh and others.
Well, I just wanted to say, Dana Thomas said you were a mentor for him, and so he couldn't make it tonight, but he wanted to.
Well, that's yeah, I was, actually, I don't know, we helped hire him, but I wasn't a mentor. I think.
Well, maybe that's what he meant.
Well, it was, well, no, it was just, the point is he came in, but I guess the mentoring part was the fact that I think Fred and I were both in maybe the first class he taught, and probably just getting Fred and I through that class probably was the best thing he could. And before I leave this, Fred and I were kind of the Bobbsey twins of taking stat courses. As I say, Fred started out because people liked the statistics. But I remember taking one class Fred and I'd signed up for, maybe one of Dana's classes. And Fred, I'd gone over and I'd picked up the book. Fred didn't know. He called me. He said, "Did you get registered?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "What color's the book?" I said, "What the hell do you mean, what color? What's the color of the cover of the book?" I said, "Well, it's blue and silver." "Geez, Dan," he said, "we're in trouble." I said, "Why?" He said, "It's one of those damn wily texts that start out just for some miserable mathematician that can do them. You know, for a normal fellow, we couldn't do it." And we'd go in there, and it was somebody like Dan Swift. Dan Swift would eat that up. But Fred Dean and I just agonized through that.
Yeah.
So that's what Dana did. He got us through that stuff.
Well, Dave Klein and Dan Hawkins, you survived, and
We've survived.
thank you for spending the evening with us.
Well, thanks.